Chapter 18 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 18. A soirée wildly interrupted and followed up by surprising revelations. One afternoon Captain Lee and Emma called on Mrs Tipps, and found her engaged in an earnest conversation with Netta. The captain, who was always in a boiling over condition, and never felt quite happy except when in the act of planning or carrying out some scheme for the increase of general happiness, soon discovered that Netta was discussing the details of a little treat which she meant to give to the boys and girls of a Sunday school which she and her mother superintended. With all this penetration he did not, however, find out that the matter which called for the most consideration was the financial part of the scheme. In other words, how to accomplish the end desired with extremely limited means. He solved the question for them, however, by asserting that he intended to give all the scholars of all the Sunday schools in the neighbourhood a treat, and of course meant to include Netta's school among the rest, unless, of course, she possessed so much exclusive pride as to refuse to join him. There was no resisting Captain Lee. As well might a redskin attempt to stop Niagara. When once he had made up his mind to "go in" for something, no mortal power could stop him. He might indeed be turned. Another object of interest, worthy of pursuit and judiciously put before him, might perhaps induce him to abandon a previous scheme, but once his steam was up, as John Marrot used to say, you could not get him to blow it off into the air. He was unlike the Iron Horse in that respect, although somewhat like him in the rigour of his action. Accordingly the thing was fixed. Invitations were sent out to all the schools and to all who took an interest in them, and the place fixed on was a field at the back of Mrs Tipps' villa. The day came, and with it the children in their best array. The weather was all that could be wished, a bright sun and a clear sky, so that the huge tent provided in case of rain was found to be only required to shade the provisions from the sun. Besides the children there were the teachers, many of them little more than children as to years, but with a happy earnestness of countenance and manner which told of another element in their breasts that evidently deepened and intensified their joy. There were several visitors and friends of Captain Lee and Mrs Tipps. Emma was there, of course, the busiest of the busy in making arrangements for the feast which consisted chiefly of fruit, buns, and milk. Netta and she managed that department together. Of course little Gertie was there and her sister Loo, from which we may conclude that Will Garvie was there in spirit, not only because that would have been natural, but because he had expressly told Loo the day before that he meant to be present in that attenuated condition. Bodily, poor fellow, he was on the footplate of the Lightning, which is as much as to say that he was everywhere by turns and nowhere long. Mrs Marrot was there too, and baby, with Nanny Stocks as his guardian. Miss Stocks' chief employment during the evening appeared to be to forget herself in the excess of her delight, and run baby's head against all sorts of persons and things. Perhaps it was as well she did so, because it tended to repress his energy. She acted the part of regulator and safety valve to that small human engine, by controlling his actions and permitting him to good-naturedly let off as much of his superfluous steam on herself. Indeed she was a species of strong buffer in this respect, receiving and neutralizing many a severe blow from his irrepressible feet and fists. Bob Marrot was also there with his bosom friend Tomtit Dorkin, whose sole occupation in life up to that time had been to put screws on nuts. This must have been "nuts" to him, as the Yankees have it, because, being a diligent little fellow, he managed to screw himself through life at the Clatterby Works to the tune of 12 shillings a week. Joseph Tipps, having got leave of absence for an evening, was also there, modest, amiable, active, and self-abnegating. So was Mrs Natalie, who, in consideration of her delicate health, was taken great care of, and very much made of, by Mrs Tipps and her family, conspicuously by Mrs Durby, who had become very fond of her since the night she had nursed her. Indeed, there is little doubt that Mrs Durby and the bottle of wine were the turning point of Mrs Natalie's illness, and that but for them poor Sam would have been a widower by that time. Mr Abel, the director, was also there, bland and beaming, with a brother director who was anything but bland or beaming, being possessed of a grave, massive, strongly marked, and stern countenance, but nevertheless owning a similar spirit and a heart which beat high in philanthropic desires and designs, though few who came in contact with him, except his intimate friends, would believe it. There were also present an elderly clergyman and a young curate, both good, earnest men, but each very different in many respects from the other. The elder clergyman had a genial, hearty countenance and manner, and he dressed very much like other gentlemen. The young curate might have breakfasted on his poker, to judge from the stiffness of his back, and appeared to be afraid of suffering from cold in the knees and chest, to judge from the length of his surtout and the height of his plain buttonless vest. When all were assembled on the green and the viands spread, the elder clergyman gave out a hymn, and the curate, who had a capital voice, led off, but he was speedily drowned by the gush of song that rose from the children's lips. It was a lively hymn, and they evidently rejoiced to sing it. Then the elder clergyman made the children a short speech. It was amazingly brief, insomuch that it quite took the little ones by surprise. So short was it, indeed, and so much to the point, that we will venture to set it down here. "Dear children," he said, in a loud voice that silenced every chattering tongue, "we have met here to enjoy ourselves. There is but one of your Sunday lessons which I will remind you of to-day. It is this: whether ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Before beginning, then, let us ask God's blessing." Thereupon he asked a blessing, which was also so brief that but for the all-prevailing name of Jesus with which he closed it, some of those who heard him would scarce have deemed it a prayer at all. Yet this elderly clergyman was not always brief. He was not brief, for instance, in his private prayers for himself, his friends, and his flock. Brevity did not mark his proceedings when engaged in preparing for the Sabbath services. He was not brief when, in his study, he pleaded with some awakened but unbelieving soul to cast itself unreservedly on the finished work of our Saviour. He was a man who carried his tact and common sense into his religious duties, who hated formalism, regarding it as one of the great stumbling blocks in the progress of Christianity, and who endeavoured at all times to suit his words and actions to the circumstances of the occasion. The children regarded him with a degree of affection that was all but irrepressible, and which induced them, at his earnest request, to sit still for a considerable time while his young brother gave them a short address. He was almost emphatic on the word short, but the young curate did not appear to take the hint, or to understand the meaning of that word either in regard to discourses or surtouts. He asserted himself in his surtouts and vest, without of course having a shadow of reason for doing so, save that some other young curates asserted themselves in the same way, and he asserted himself then and there in a tone of voice called sermonizing, to which foolish young men are sometimes addicted, and which, by the way, being a false, and therefore irreligious tone, is another great stumbling block in the way of Christianity. And, curiously enough, this young curate was really an earnest, though mistaken and intensely bigoted young man. We call him bigoted, not because he held his own opinions, but because he held by his little formalities with as much apparent fervour as he held by the grand doctrines of his religion, although for the latter he had the authority of the Word, while for the former he had merely the authority of man. His discourse was a good one, and if delivered in a natural voice and at a suitable time might have made a good impression. As it was, it produced pity and regret in his elder brother, exasperation in Captain Lee, profound melancholy in Joseph Tipps, great admiration in Miss Stocks and the baby, and unutterable ennui in the children. Fortunately for the success of the day, in the middle of it, he took occasion to make some reference, with allegorical intentions, to the lower animals, and pointed to a pig which lay basking in the sunshine at no great distance, an unconcerned spectator of the scene. A rather fat, faced, obtuse boy was suddenly smitten with the belief that this was intended as a joke, and dutifully clapped his hands. The effect was electrical. An irresistible cheer and clapping of hands ensued. It was of no use to attempt to check it. The more this was tried the more did the children seem to think they were invited to a continuance of their ovation to the young curate, who finally retired among the hearty though unexpressed congratulations of the company. By good fortune, the arrival of several more friends diverted attention from this incident, and immediately after, Captain Lee set the children to engage in various games, among which the favourite was blind man's buff. One of the new arrivals was Edwin Gurwood, who had come, he said, to introduce a gentleman, Dr Noble, to Mrs Tipps. "Oh, the hypocrite!" thought Mrs Tipps. "He has come to see Emma Lee, and he knows it." Of course he knew it, and he knew that Mrs Tipps knew it, and he knew that Mrs Tipps knew that he knew it. Yet neither he or Mrs Tipps showed the slightest symptom of all that knowledge. The latter bowed to Dr Noble, and was expressing her happiness in making his acquaintance, when a rush of laughing children almost overturned her, and hurled Dr Noble aside. They were immediately separated in the crowd, and, strange to say, Edwin at once found himself standing beside Emma Lee, who, by some curious coincidence, had just parted from Netta, so that they found themselves comparatively alone. What they said to each other in these circumstances it does not become us to divulge. While all parties were enjoying themselves to the full, including the young curate, whose discomfiture was softened by the kind attentions of Mrs Tipps and her daughter, an incident occurred which filled them with surprise and consternation. Dr Noble was standing at the time near the large tent looking at the games, and Nanny Stocks was not far from him choking the baby with alternate sweetmeats and kisses, to the horror of Joseph Tipps, who fully expected to witness a case of croup or some such infantine disease in a few minutes, when suddenly a tall man with torn clothes, dishevelled hair, and bloodshot eyes, sprang forward and confronted Dr Noble. "Ha!" he exclaimed with a wild laugh. "Have I found you at last, mine enemy?" Dr Noble looked at him with much surprise, but did not reply. He appeared to be paralysed. "I have sought you," continued the man, trembling with ill-suppressed passion, "over land and sea, and now I've found you. You've got the casket. You know you have. You took it from my wife the night she died. You shall give it up now, or you die." He spluttered rather than spoke the last words between his teeth, as he made a spring at the doctor. Edwin Gurwood had seen the man approach, and at once to his amazement, recognizing the features of Thomson, his old opponent in the train, he ran towards him, but was not near enough to prevent his first wild attack. Fortunately for Dr Noble this was thwarted by no less a personage than Joseph Tipps, who, seeing what was intended, sprang promptly forward, and, seizing the man by the legs, adroitly threw him down. With a yell that sent a chill of horror to all the young hearts round, the madman, for such he plainly was, leapt up, but before he could renew his attack he was in the powerful grasp of his old enemy, Edwin Gurwood. A terrific struggle ensued, for both men, as we have said before, were unusually powerful, but on this occasion madness more than counterbalanced Edwin's superior strength. For some time they wrestled so fiercely that none of the other gentlemen could interfere with effect. They dashed down the large tent and went crashing through the debris of the feast, until at last Thomson made a sudden twist, freed himself from Edwin's grasp, leaving a shred of his coat in his hands, and, flying across the field, leapt at a single bound the wall that encompassed it. He was closely followed by Edwin and by a constable of a district, who happened to arrive upon the scene, but the fugitive left them far behind, and was soon out of sight. This incident put an end to the evening's enjoyment, but as the greater part of it had already passed delightfully before Thomson came on the ground to mar the sport, the children returned home much pleased with themselves and everybody else, despite the concluding scene. Meanwhile Mrs Tipps invited her friends who had assembled there to take tea in Eden Villa, and here Dr Noble was eagerly questioned as to his knowledge of his late assailant, but he either could not or would not throw light on the subject. Some of the guests left early and some late, but to Mrs Tipps' surprise the doctor remained till the last of them had said good night, after which, to her still greater surprise, he drew his chair close to the table, and, looking at her and Netta with much earnestness, said "Probably you are surprised, ladies, that I, a stranger, have remained so long tonight. The truth is, I had come here to have some conversation on private and very important matters, but finding you so lively, and, I must add, so pleasantly engaged, I deemed it expedient to defer my conversation until you should be more at leisure." He paused as if to collect his thoughts, and the ladies glanced at each other uneasily, and in some surprise, but made no reply. In truth, remembering the scene they had just witnessed, they began to suspect that another style of madman had thought fit to pay them a visit. He resumed, however, with every appearance of sanity, "How the madman who assaulted me this evening found me out I know not. I was not aware until this day that he had been tracking me, but, judging from what he hath said, and from what I know about him, I now see he must have been doing so for some years. Here is the explanation, and, let me add, it intimately concerns yourselves." Mrs Tipps and Netta became more interested as Dr Noble proceeded. "You must know," he said, "that when in India some years ago I made several coasting voyages with a certain sea captain as surgeon of his ship, at periods when my health required recruiting. I received from that gentleman every attention and kindness that the heart of a good man could suggest. One of these voyages we had a native prince on board. He was voyaging, like myself, for the benefit of his health, but his case was a bad one. He grew rapidly worse, and before the end of the voyage he died. During his illness the captain nursed him as if he had been his own child, all the more tenderly that he thought him to be one of those unfortunate princes who, owing to political changes, had been ruined, and had lost all his wealth along with his station. It was quite touching, I assure you, madame, to listen to the earnest tones of that captain's voice as he read passages from the Word of God to the dying prince, and sought to convince him that Jesus Christ, who became poor for our sakes, could bestow spiritual wealth that neither the world, nor life, nor death could take away. Prince spoke very little, but he listened most intently. Just before he died he sent a sailor lad, who attended on him, for the captain, and taking a small box from beneath his pillow, gave it to him, saying briefly, 'Here, take it, you have been my best friend, I shall need it no more.' After he was dead the box was opened, and found to contain a most superb set of diamonds, a necklace, brooch, ear-rings, bracelets, and a ring, besides a quantity of gold pieces, the whole being worth several thousands of pounds. As the prince had often said that all his kindred were dead, the captain had no conscientious scruples in retaining the gift. He locked it away in his cabin. When the voyage was finished, at Calcutta, the men were paid off. The captain then bethought him of placing his treasure in some place of security in the city. He went to his chest and took out the box. It was light. He opened it hastily. The contents were gone. Nothing was left to him of that splendid gift save the ring, which he had placed on his finger soon after receiving it, and had worn ever since. From some circumstances that recurred to our memories, we both suspected the young man who had been in attendance on the prince, but although we caused the most diligent search to be made, we failed to find him. My friend and I parted soon after. I was sent up to the hills, and never saw or heard of him again. Several years after that I happened to be residing in Calcutta, and was called one night to see the wife of an Englishman who was thought to be dying. I found her very ill, near her end. She seemed to be anxious to communicate something to me, but appeared to be afraid of her husband. I thought, on looking on him attentively, that I had seen him before, and said so. He seemed to be annoyed, and denied ever having met me. I treated the matter lightly, but took occasion to send him out for some physic, and, while he was away, encouraged the woman to unburden her mind. She was not slow to do so. "Oh, sir," she said, "I want to communicate a secret, but dared not while my husband was by. Long ago, before I knew him, my husband stole a box of diamonds from a Captain Tipps." "My husband!" exclaimed the widow. "You shall hear," said Dr Noble. "I often heard him tell the story, and boast of it," continued the sick woman, quietly, "and I resolved to obtain possession of the box, and have it returned, if possible, to the rightful owner. So I carried out my purpose, no matter how, and led him to suppose that the treasure had been stolen, but I have often fancied he did not believe me. This Captain Tipps was a friend of yours, sir. I know it, because my husband has told me. He remembers you, although you don't remember him. I wish you to return the box to Captain Tipps, sir, if he is yet alive. It lies—" Here she drew me close to her, and whispered in my ear the exact spot under a tree where the jewels were hid. "You'll be sure to remember the place?" she asked anxiously. "Remember what place?" demanded her husband, sternly, as he returned with the medicine. No answer was given. The woman fell back on hearing his voice, but, although she lived for nearly an hour, never spoke again. The man turned on me, and asked again what place she had been speaking of. I said that it was idle to repeat what might prove to be only the ravings of a dying woman. He seized a bludgeon, and, raising it in a threatening manner, said, "I know you, Dr Noble. You shall tell me what I want to know, else you shall not quit this room alive." "I know you too, Thomson," said I, drawing a small sword from a stick I always carried. "If you proceed to violence, it remains to be seen who shall quit this room alive." I opened the door and walked quietly out, leaving him glaring like a tiger after me. Going to the place described, I found the diamonds, and from that day to this I have not ceased to try to discover my old friend, but have not yet succeeded. Knowing that he might be dead, I have made inquiry of everyone possessing your name, Mrs Tipps, in the hope of discovering his widow or children; and, although your name is an uncommon one, madame, you would be surprised if you knew how many I have ferreted out in the course of years. Unfortunately, my friend never mentioned his family, or the place of his residence in England, so I have had no clue to guide me save one. I have even found 2 widows of the name of Tipps besides yourself, and one of these said that her husband was a sailor captain, but her description of him was not that of my friend. The other said her husband had been a lawyer, so of course he could not be the man of whom I was in search. "But, sir," said Mrs Tipps, in some perplexity, "if you are to depend on description, I fear that you will never attain your end, for everyone knows that descriptions given of the same person by different people never quite agree." "That is true, madame. And the description given to me this evening of your late husband is a case in point, for, although it agrees in many things, in most things there is some discrepancy. Did your husband never give you the slightest hint about a set of diamonds he had once lost?" "Never, but I can account for that by the fact that he never alluded to anything that had at any time given him pain or pleasure, if he could avoid it." "There is but the one clue, then, that I spoke of, namely the ring that belonged to the set of diamonds. Did your husband ever possess—" "The ring!" exclaimed Mrs Tipps and Netta in the same breath. "Yes, he had a diamond ring." They stopped abruptly, and looked at each other in distress, for they remembered that the ring had been lost. "Pray, what sort of ring is it? Describe it to me," said Dr Noble. Netta carefully described it, and, as she did so, the visitor's countenance brightened. That's it exactly. That must be it, for I remember it well, and it corresponds in all respects with— My dear ladies, let me see the ring without delay." "Alas, sir," said Mrs Tipps, sadly, "the ring is lost." A look of blank dismay clouded poor Dr Noble's visage as he heard these words, but he quickly questioned the ladies as to the loss, and became more hopeful on bearing the news. "Come," he said at last, as he rose to take leave, "things don't look quite so bad as they did at first. From all I have heard I am quite convinced that my friend's widow and daughter are before me. A sight of the ring would put the question beyond all doubt. We must therefore set to work at once and bend all our energies to the one great point of recovering the lost ring." End of chapter 18. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles.
Chapter 22. The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearing House of the Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Soirée. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 22. The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearing House. Let us turn now for a brief space to Edwin Gurwood. He is seated before a desk in one of the rooms of that large building in Seymour Street, Euston Square, London, where a perfect army of clerks, about 1,000, clear up many of the mysteries and overcome a number of the difficulties incident to the railway traffic of the kingdom. At the particular time we write of, Edwin was frowning very hard at a business book and thinking of Emma Lee. The cause of his frown, no doubt, was owing to the conflict between duty and inclination that happened to rage in his bosom just then. His time belonged to the railways of the United Kingdom. To Emma belonged his heart. The latter was absent without leave, and the mind, thus basely forsaken, became distracted and refused to make good use of time. That day, Edwin met with a coincidence. He made what he believed to be a discovery, and almost at the same moment received an inquiry as to the subject of that discovery. While endeavoring, without much success, to fix his attention on a case of lost luggage which it was his duty to investigate, and frowning, as we have said, at the business book, his eye was suddenly arrested by the name of Derby. Derby, he muttered. Surely that name is familiar. Derby. Why, yes, that's the name of Tip's old nurse. Reading on, he found that the name of Derby was connected with a diamond ring. Well now, that is strange, he muttered to himself. At the first glance, I thought this must be the brown paper parcel that I made inquiry about at the station of the Grand National Trunk Railway long ago. But the diamond ring puts that out of the question. No nurse in her senses would travel with a diamond ring tied up in a brown paper parcel the size of her head. We may remind the reader here that when the brown paper parcel was found and carried to the lost luggage office of one of our Western railways, a note of its valuable contents was sent to the clearinghouse in London. This was recorded in a book. As all inquiries after lost property, wheresoever made throughout the kingdom, are also forwarded to the clearinghouse. It follows that the notes of losses and notes of inquiries meet, and thus the lost and the losers are brought together and reunited with a facility that would be impracticable without such a central agency. In the case of our diamond ring, however, no proper inquiry had been made. Consequently, there was only the loss recorded on the books of the clearinghouse. While Edwin was pondering this matter, a note was put into his hands by a junior clerk. It contained an inquiry after a diamond ring which had been wrapped up in a large brown paper parcel, with the name Derby written on it in pencil, and was lost many months before between Clatterby and London. The note further set forth that the ring was the property of Mrs. Tipps of Eden Villa, and enclosed from that lady a minute description of the ring. It was signed James Noble, M.D. Wonderful, exclaimed Edwin. The most singular coincidence I ever experienced. Having thus delivered himself, he took the necessary steps to have the ring sent to London, and obtained leave, being an intimate friend of the Tipps family, to run down by train and deliver it. While he is away on this errand, we will take the opportunity of mounting his stool and jotting down a few particulars about the clearinghouse, which are worth knowing, for that establishment is not only an invaluable means of effecting such happy reunions of the lost and the losers, as we have referred to, but is in many other ways one of the most important institutions of the kingdom. The Railway Clearinghouse is so named, we presume, because it clears up railway accounts that would, but for its intervention, become inextricably confused, and because it enables all the different lines in the country to interchange facilities for through booking traffic and clears up their respective accounts in reference to the same. Something of the use and value of the clearinghouse may be shown at a glance by explaining that before the great schemes of amalgamation, which have now been carried out, each railway company booked passengers and goods only as far as its own rails went. And at this point, fresh tickets had to be taken out and carriages changed, with all the disagreeable accompaniments and delays of shifting luggage, etc. Before through booking was introduced, a traveler between London and Inverness was compelled to renew his ticket and change luggage 4 times between Darlington and Cardiff, 6 times. In some journeys, no fewer than 9 or 10 changes were necessary. This, as traffic increased, of course, became intolerable. It is quite certain that the present extent of passenger and goods traffic could never have been attained if the old system had continued. It was felt to be absolutely necessary that not only passengers, but carriages and goods must be passed over as many lines as possible at straight through to their destinations, with no needless delays and without breaking bulk. But how was this to be accomplished? There were difficulties in the way of through booking which do not appear at first sight. When, for instance, a traveler goes from London to Edinburgh by the East Coast route, he passes over 3 different railways of unequal length or mileage. The Great Northern furnishes his ticket and gives him station accommodation besides providing his carriage, while the Northeastern and North British permit him to run over their lines, and the latter also furnishes station accommodation and collects his ticket. To ascertain precisely how much of that traveler's fare is due to each company involves a careful and nice calculation. Besides this, the whole fare is paid to the Great Northern, and it would be unjust to expect that that company should be saddled with the trouble of making the calculation and the expense of remitting its share to each of the other companies. So too with goods, one company furnishing the wagon and tarpaulin, besides undertaking the trouble of loading and furnishing station accommodation and the use of its line, while it may be several other companies give the use of their lines only, and that to a variable extent. In addition to all this, the company providing its carriage or wagons is entitled to demurrage for every day beyond a certain time that these are detained by the companies to which they do not belong. Now, if all this be unavoidable, even in the case of a single fare or a small parcel, it must be self-evident that in lines where the interchange of through traffic is great and constant, it would have been all but impossible for the railway companies to manage their business, and the system would have given rise to endless disputes. In order to settle accounts of this description, it was soon seen to be absolutely necessary that some sort of arrangement must be come to, and accordingly, the idea of a central office was conceived, and a system established without delay, which for minute detail and comprehensive grasp is unrivaled by any other institution. At first, only a few of the railway companies united in establishing the clearinghouse in 1842, but by degrees, as its immense value became known, other companies joined, and it now embraces all the leading companies in the kingdom. It is said to be not inferior to the War Office, Colonial Office, and Admiralty in regard to the amount of work it gets through in a year. Its accounts amount to some 12 millions sterling, yet they always must and do balance to a fraction of a farthing. There must never be a surplus and never a deficiency in its funds, for it can make no profits, being simply a thoroughly honest and disinterested and perfectly correct go-between, which adjusts the mutual obligations of railways in a quick and economical manner. Its accounts are balanced every month, and every pound, shilling, and penny can be accounted for. It annually receives and dispenses a revenue greater than that of many European kingdoms. In 1847, its gross receipts were only £793,701. In 1868, they had risen to above 11 millions. Each line connected with the clearinghouse has a representative on the committee to look after its interests and bears its proportion of the expenses of the establishment. Before showing the manner in which the work is performed for the railway companies, it may be well to premise that one great good which the clearinghouse system does to the public is to enable them to travel everywhere with as much facility as if there were only one railway and one company in the kingdom. To avoid going into too much detail, we may say briefly that in regard to goods, statements of through traffic dispatched are sent daily from thousands of stations to the clearinghouse. Also, separate statements of through traffic received. These are compared. Of those that are found to agree, each company is debited or credited as the case may be, with the proportion due to or by it. Where discrepancies occur, correspondence ensues until the thing is cleared up, and then the distribution to the accounts of the several companies takes place. As discrepancies are numerous and constant, correspondence is necessarily great. So minutely correct and particular are they at the clearinghouse that a shilling is sometimes divided between 4 companies. Even a penny is deemed worthy of being debited to one company and credited to another. As it is with goods, so is it with passengers. Through tickets are sent from all the stations to the clearinghouse, where they are examined and compared with the returns of the tickets issued, and then sent back to their respective companies. As these tickets amount to many thousands a day, some idea may be formed of the amount of labor bestowed on the examination of them. The proportions of each ticket due to each company are then credited, and statements of the same made out and forwarded to the several companies daily. From the 2 sets of returns forwarded to the clearinghouse, statements of the debit and credit balances are made out weekly. Parcels are treated much in the same way as the goods. Mileage is a branch of service which requires a separate staff of men. There are hundreds and thousands of wagons, loaded and empty, constantly running to and fro, day and night, on various lines to which they do not belong. Each individual wagon must be traced and accounted for to the clearinghouse from its start to its arrival and back again. And not only wagons, but even the individual tarpaulins that cover them are watched and noted in this way, in order that the various companies over whose lines they pass may get their due, and that the companies owning them may get their demurrage if they be improperly detained on the way. For this purpose, at every point where separate railways join, there are station men in the pay of the clearinghouse whose duty it is to take the numbers of all passenger carriages and goods, wagons and tarpaulins, and make a daily statement of the same to the clearinghouse. As daily returns of all foreign carriages arriving and departing from all clearinghouse stations are forwarded to the same office, they are thus in a position to check the traffic, detect discrepancies, and finally make the proper entries as to mileage and demurrage in the accounts of the respective companies. Frequently, the charge of 1/10 of a penny per mile for a tarpaulin is divided among several companies in various proportions. For a wagon or carriage from Edinburgh to London, mileage and demurrage accounts are sent out by the clearinghouse to 4 companies. Formerly, before demurrage was introduced, carriages were frequently detained on lines to which they did not belong for weeks and even months, until sometimes they were lost sight of altogether. Once a month, the balances are struck, and the various railways, instead of having to pay enormous sums to each other, obtain settlement by a means of comparatively small balances. For example, the London and North Western Railway sends its through passengers over the Caledonian Line. The mileage charged for its foreign carriages is 3 farthings per mile. Small though that sum is, it amounts, at the end of the month, perhaps to £5,000. This little bill is sent to the clearinghouse by the Caledonian against the London and North Western. But during that same period, the latter company has been running up a somewhat similar bill against the former company. Both accounts are sent into the clearinghouse. They amount together to perhaps some 15 or 20,000 pounds. Yet when one is set off against the other, a 10 or 20 pound note may be all that is required to change hands in order to balance the accounts. The total mileage of lines under the jurisdiction of the clearinghouse, and over which it exercises complete surveillance on every train that passes up or down, night or day, as far as regulating the various interests of the companies is concerned, amounts to more than 14,000. The Times, at the conclusion of a very interesting article on this subject, says, "Our whole railway system would be as nothing without the clearinghouse," which affords another illustration of the great truth that the British railway public is the best served railway public in the world, and, on the whole, the least grateful. We hope and incline to believe that in the latter remark, the great thunderer is wrong, and that it is only a small, narrow-minded, and ignorant section of the public which is ungrateful. Disputed claims between railways are referred to the arbitration of the Committee of the Clearinghouse, from whose decision there is no appeal. The trouble taken in connection with the lost luggage department is very great, written communications being sent to almost innumerable stations on various lines of rails for every inquiry that is made to the house after lost luggage. It is a striking commentary at once on the vast extent of traffic in the kingdom, and the great value in one important direction of this establishment: the fact that in 1 year the number of articles accounted for to the clearinghouse by stations as left by passengers, either on the platforms or in carriages, amounted to 156,769 trunks, bags, and parcels, and of these, nearly 95 in every 100 were restored through the clearinghouse to their owners. It is probable that the property thus restored would amount to $500,000 of money. This reminds us that we left Edwin Gurwood on his way to restore Mrs. Tipps her lost ring, and that, therefore, it is our duty to resume the thread of our story, with, of course, a humble apology to the patient reader for having again given way to our irresistible tendency to digress. End of chapter 22. The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearinghouse. Recording by Sarah Sarai, Las Vegas, Nevada. My website is www.fairyjanes.com. End of The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine.
Chapter 20 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 20. A Nest Harried. Having thus seen one criminal disposed of, Mr. Sharp returned to his office to take measures for the arrest of a few more of the same class. Since we last met with our superintendent, he had not led an idle life by any means. A brief reference to some of his recent doings will be an appropriate introduction to the little entertainment which he had provided for himself and his men on that particular evening. One day he had been informed that wine and spirits had been disappearing unaccountably at a particular station. He visited the place with one of his men, spent the night under a tarpaulin in a goods shed, and found that one of the plate-layers was in the habit of drawing off spirits with a siphon. The guilty man was handed over to justice, and honest men, who had felt uneasy lest they should be suspected, were relieved. On another occasion he was sent to investigate a claim made by a man who was in the accident at Langrye station. This man, who was an auctioneer, had not been hurt at all, only a little skin taken off his nose, but our fop with the check trousers advised him to make a job of it, and said that he himself and his friend had intended to make a claim, only they had another and more important game in hand, which rendered it advisable for them to keep quiet. This was just before the attack made on Mr. Lee in the train between Clatterby and London. The auctioneer had not thought of such a way of raising money, but jumped readily at the idea, went to Glasgow and Dundee, where he consulted doctors, showed them his broken nose, coughed harshly in their ears, complained of nervous affections, pains in the back, loins, and head, and pricking his gums slightly, spit blood for their edification, spoke of internal injuries, and shook his head lugubriously. Doctors, unlike lawyers, are not constantly on the watch for impostors. The man's peeled and swelled nose was an obvious fact. His other ailments might or might not be serious, so they prescribed, condoled with him, charged him nothing, and dismissed him with a hope of speedy cure. Thereafter the auctioneer went down the Clyde to recruit his injured health, and did a little in the way of business, just to keep up his spirits, poor fellow. After that he visited Aberdeen for similar purposes, and then sent in a claim of £150 damages against the Grand National Trunk Railway. Mr. Sharp's first proceeding was to visit the doctors to whom the auctioneer had applied. Then he visited the various watering-places whither the man had gone to recruit, and ascertained every particular regarding his proceedings. Finally he went to the north of Scotland to see the interesting invalid himself. He saw and heard him first in an auction-room, where he went through a hard day's work even for a healthy man. Then he visited him in his hotel, and found him, the picture of ruddy health, drinking whisky punch. On stating that he was an agent of the railway company, and had called to have some conversation regarding his claim, some of the auctioneer's ruddy colour fled, but being a bold man, he assumed a candid air, and willingly answered all questions, admitted that he was better, but said that he had lost much time, had for a long period been unable to attend to his professional duties, and still suffered much from internal injuries. Mr. Sharp expressed sympathy with him, said that the case, as he put it, was indeed a hard one, and begged of him to put his statement of it down on paper. The auctioneer complied, and thought Mr Sharp a rather benignant railway official. When he had signed his name to the paper, his visitor took it up and said, "Now, Mr Blank, this is all lies from beginning to end. I have traced your history step by step down to the present time, visited all the places you have been to, conversed with the waiters of the hotels where you put up, have heard you to-day go through as good a day's work as any strong man could desire to do, and have seen you finish up with a stiff glass of whisky toddy, which I am very sorry to have interrupted. Now, sir, this is very like an effort to obtain money under false pretences, and if you don't know what that leads to, you are in a very fair way to find out. The company which I have the honour to represent, however, is generous. We know that you were in the Langrye accident, for I saw you there, and in consideration of the injury to your nerves and the damage to your proboscis, we are willing to give you a £5 note as a sort of sticking plaster at once to your nose and your feelings. If you accept that, good. If not, you shall take the consequence of this." The superintendent here held up the written statement playfully, and placed it in his pocket-book. The auctioneer was a wise, if not honest, man. He thankfully accepted the £5, and invited Mr Sharp to join him in a tumbler, which, however, the superintendent politely declined. But this was a small matter compared with another case which Mr Sharp had just been engaged investigating. It was as follows. One afternoon a slight accident occurred on the line by which several passengers received trifling injuries. At the time only two people made claim for compensation, one for a few shillings, the other for a few pounds. These cases were at once investigated and settled, and it was thought that there the matter ended. 6 months afterwards, however, the company received a letter from the solicitors of a gentleman whose hat, it was said, had been driven down on the bridge of his nose, and had abraded the skin. The slight wound had turned into an ulcer, which ultimately assumed the form of permanent cancer. In consequence of this, the gentleman had consulted one doctor in Paris and another in Rome, and had been obliged to undergo an operation, for all of which he claimed compensation to the extent of £5,000. The company being quite unable to tell whether this gentleman was in the accident referred to or not, an investigation was set on foot, in which Mr Sharp bore his part. At great expense, official persons were sent to Paris and to Rome to see the doctors said to have been consulted, and in the end, nearly 2 years after the accident, the company was found liable for the £5,000. While we are on the subject of compensation, it may not be uninteresting to relate a few curious cases, which will give some idea of the manner in which railway companies are squeezed for damages, sometimes unjustly, and too often fraudulently. On one occasion, a man who said he had been in an accident on one of our large railways claimed £1,000. In this case, the company was fortunately able to prove a conspiracy to defraud, and thus escaped. But in many instances the companies are defeated in fraudulent claims, and there is no redress. The feelings of the juries who try the cases are worked on. Patients are brought into court exhibiting every symptom of hopeless malady, but these same patients not unfrequently possess quite miraculous powers of swift recovery from what had been styled incurable damage. One man received £6,000 on the supposition that he had been permanently disabled, and within a short period he was attending to his business as well as ever. A youth with a salary of £60 a year claimed and got £1,200 on the ground of incurable injury. In other words, he was pensioned for life to the extent of £60 a year, and a year afterwards it was ascertained that he was dancing at balls, and had joined his father in business as if there was nothing the matter with him. A barmaid who, it was said, received injuries to the spine of a permanent character, and paid a sum of £1,000, as, we were about to write, compensation, but consolation would be more the appropriate term, seeing that she had little or nothing to be compensated for, as she was found capable of dancing at the licensed victuallers' ball soon after the accident, and eventually she married. To oblige railways to compensate for loss of time or property or health to a limited extent seems reasonable, but to compel them to pension off people who have suffered little or nothing, with snug little annuities of £50 or £60, does really seem to be a little too hard. At least, so it appears to be in the eyes of one who happens to have no interest whatever in railways, save that general interest in the immense value to the land, and their inestimable comforts in the matter of locomotion. The whole subject of compensation stands at present on a false footing. For the comfort of those who wish well to railways, and love justice, we may add in conclusion, that proposals as to modifications have already been mooted and brought before Government, so that, in all probability, ere long, impostors will receive a snubbing, and shareholders will receive increased dividends. But let us return to Mr Sharp. Having, as we have said, gone to his office, he found his faithful servant Blunt there. "Why, Blunt," he said, sitting down at the table and tearing open a few letters that awaited him, "what a good-looking porter you make!" "So my wife says, sir," replied Blunt, with a perfectly grave face, but with a twinkle in his eye. "She must be a discriminating woman, Blunt. Well, what news have you to-night? You seem to think you had found out the thieves at Gorton Station the last time we met." "So I have, sir, and there are more implicated than we had expected. The place is a perfect nest of them." "Not an uncommon state of things," observed Mr Sharp, "for it is well known that one black sheep spoils a flock. We must weed them all out, Blunt, and get our garden into as tidy a condition as possible. It is beginning to do us credit already, but that Gorton Station has remained too long in a bad state. We must harrow it up a little. Well, let's hear what you have found out. They never suspected you, I suppose?" "Never had the least suspicion," replied Blunt, with a slight approach to a smile. "I've lived with 'em now for a considerable time, and the general opinion of 'em about me is that I'm a decent enough fellow, but too slow and stupid to be trusted. So they have not, up to this time, thought me worthy of being made a confidant. However, that didn't matter much, 'cause I managed to get round one of their wives at last, and she let out the whole affair, in strict confidence, of course, and as a dead secret. In fact, I have just come from a long and interesting conversation with her. She told me that all the men at the station, with one or two exceptions, were engaged in it, and showed me two of the missing bales of cloth, the cloth, you remember, sir, of which there was such a large quantity stolen 4 weeks ago, and for which the company has had to pay. I find that the chief signalman, Davis, is as bad as the rest. It was his wife that gave me the information in a moment of over-confidence." "Indeed!" exclaimed Sharp, in some surprise. "And what of Sam Natly and Garvie?" "They're both of 'em innocent, sir," said Blunt. "I did suspect 'em at one time, but I have seen and heard enough to convince me that they have no hand in the business. Natly has been going about the station a good deal of late, because the wife of one of the men is a friend of his wife, and used to go up to nurse her sometime when she was ill. As to Garvie, of course he knows as well as everybody else that some of the men there must be thieves, else goods would not disappear from that station as they do. But his frequent visits there are for the purpose of reclaiming Davis, who, it seems, is an old playmate of his." "Reclaiming Davis!" exclaimed Sharp. "Yes, and it's my opinion that it'll take a cleverer fellow than him to reclaim Davis, for he's one of the worst of the lot. But Garvie is real earnest. I chanced to get behind a hedge one day when they were together, and overheard them talking about these robberies and other matters, and you would have thought, sir, that the fireman was a regular divine. He could quote Scripture quite in a stunning way, sir, and did seem badly cut up when his friend told him that it was of no use talking, for it was too late for him to mend." "Has Garvie, then, been aware all this time that Davis is one of the thieves, and kept it secret?" asked Sharp. "No, sir," replied Blunt. "Davis denied that he had any hand in the robberies when Garvie asked him. It was about drink that he was pleading with him so hard. You know we have suspected him of that, too, of late. But from what I heard he must be a regular toper. Garvie was trying to persuade him to become a total abstainer. Says he to him, 'You know, Davis, that whatever may be true as to the general question of abstaining from strong drink, your only chance of being delivered lies in total abstinence, because the thing has become a disease. I know and believe that Christianity would save you from the power of drink, but, depend upon it, that it would do so in the way of inducing you of your own free will to touch not, taste not, handle not, that which you will perish by the using.'" "Seems to me as if there was something in that, sir," said Blunt inquiringly. Sharp nodded assent. "Then Garvie does not suspect him of being connected with the robberies?" he asked. "No," replied Blunt; "but he's a deep file, is Davis, and could throw a sharper man than Garvie off the scent." After a little further conversation on the subject, Mr Sharp dismissed the pretended porter to his station, and called upon the superintendent of the police force of Clatterby, from whom he received an addition to his force of men. That night he led his men to Gorton station, and when he thought a suitable hour had arrived, he caused them to surround the block of buildings in which the men of the station resided. Then, placing Blunt and 2 or 3 men in front of Davis's house, he went up to the door alone and knocked. Mrs Davis opened it. She gave the least possible start in observing by the light of her lobby lamp who her visitor was, for she knew him well. Mr Sharp took note of the start. "Good evening, Mrs Davis," he said. "Good evening, sir. This is an unexpected pleasure, Mr Sharp." "Most of my visits are unexpected, Mrs Davis, but it is only my friends who count them a pleasure. Is your husband within?" "He is, sir. Pray walk this way. I'm sure he will be delighted to see you. Can you stay to supper with us? We are just going to have it." "No, thank you, Mrs Davis. I'm out on duty to-night," said Sharp, entering the parlour, where Davis was engaged in reading the newspaper. "Good evening, Mr Davis." Davis rose with a start. Mr Sharp took note of that also. "Good evening, Mr Sharp," he said. "Sit down, sir, sit down." "Thank you, I can't sit down. I'm on duty just now. The fact is, Mr Davis, that I am come to make a search among your men, for we have obtained reliable information as to who are the thieves at this station. As, no doubt, some of the men are honest, and might feel hurt at having their houses searched, I have thought that the best way to prevent any unpleasant feeling is to begin at the top of the free and go downwards. They can't say that I made a fish of one and flesh of another, if I begin, as a mere matter of form, Mr Davis, with yourself." "Oh, certainly, certainly, Mr Sharp, by all means," replied Davis. He spoke with an air of candour, but it was quite evident that he was ill at ease. Calling in one of his men, Mr Sharp began a rigorous search of the house forthwith. Mr Davis suggested that he would go out and see that the men were in their residences, but Mr Sharp said that there was no occasion for that, and that he would be obliged by his remaining and assisting in the search of his own house. Every hole and corner of the ground floor was examined, without any discovery being made. Mrs Davis, observing that her visitors were particular in collecting every shred of cloth that came in their way, suddenly asked if it was cloth they were in search of. Mr Sharp thought the question and the tone in which it was put told of a guilty conscience, but he replied that he was in search of many things, cloth included. Immediately after, and while they were busy with the dark closet, Mrs Davis slipped quietly out of the room. Mr Sharp was stooping at the time with his back towards her, but the 2 back bottoms of his coat must have been eyes, for he observed the movement and at once followed her, having previously ordered Mr Davis to move a heavy chest of drawers in order to keep him employed. Taking off his shoes, he went upstairs rapidly, and seeing an open door, peeped in. There he saw a sight that would have surprised any man except a superintendent of police. Mrs. Davis was engaged in throwing bales of cloth over the window with the energy of a coal heaver and the haste of one whose house is on fire. The poor woman was not robust, yet the easy way in which she handled those bales was quite marvelous. Being a cool and patient man, Sharp allowed her to toss over 5 bales before interrupting her. When she was moving across the room with the 6th and last, he entered. She stopped, turned pale, and dropped the bale of cloth. "You seem to be very busy to-night, Mrs. Davis," he observed, inquiringly. "Can I assist you?" "Oh, Mr. Sharp!" exclaimed Mrs. Davis, covering her face with her hands. She could say no more. Mr. Sharp took her gently by the arm and led her downstairs. They reached the room below just in time to see Blunt enter, holding the ejected bales with both arms to his bosom. Blunt had happened to take his stand just beneath the window of Mrs. Davis's bedroom, and when that energetic woman tossed the bales out, she pitched them straight into Blunt's willing arms. The accommodating man waited until he received all that appeared likely to be delivered to him, and then with a quiet chuckle bore them, as we have seen, into Davis's parlor. "This is a bad business, Davis," said Sharp, as he slipped a pair of manacles on his prisoner. Davis made no reply. He was very pale, but looked defiant. Mrs. Davis sat down on a chair and sobbed. Leaving them in charge of Blunt, Mr. Sharp then paid a visit to all the men of the place, and ere long succeeded in capturing all who had been engaged in the recent robberies, with the various proofs of their guilt, in the shape of cloth, loaves of sugar, fruit, boxes of tea, etc., in their apartments. It had cost Mr. Sharp and his men many weary hours of waiting and investigation, but their perseverance was at length well rewarded, for the Nest was thoroughly harried. The men were dismissed and variously punished, and that portion of the Grand National Trunk Railway was, for the time, most effectually purified. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 22, The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearing House of the Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Soirée. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 22, The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearing House. Let us turn now for a brief space to Edwin Gurwood. He is seated before a desk in one of the rooms of that large building in Seymour Street, Euston Square, London, where a perfect army of clerks, about 1,000, clear up many of the mysteries and overcome a number of the difficulties incident to the railway traffic of the kingdom. At the particular time we write of, Edwin was frowning very hard at a business book and thinking of Emma Lee. The cause of his frown, no doubt, was owing to the conflict between duty and inclination that happened to rage in his bosom just then. His time belonged to the railways of the United Kingdom. To Emma belonged his heart. The latter was absent without leave, and the mind, thus basely forsaken, became distracted and refused to make good use of time. That day, Edwin met with a coincidence. He made what he believed to be a discovery, and almost at the same moment received an inquiry as to the subject of that discovery. While endeavoring, without much success, to fix his attention on a case of lost luggage which it was his duty to investigate, and frowning, as we have said, at the business book, his eye was suddenly arrested by the name of Derby. "Derby," he muttered. "Surely that name is familiar. Derby. Why, yes, that's the name of Tip's old nurse." Reading on, he found that the name of Derby was connected with a diamond ring. Well now, "That is strange," he muttered to himself. "At the first glance, I thought this must be the brown paper parcel that I made inquiry about at the station of the Grand National Trunk Railway long ago. But the diamond ring puts that out of the question. No nurse in her senses would travel with a diamond ring tied up in a brown paper parcel the size of her head." We may remind the reader here that when the brown paper parcel was found and carried to the lost luggage office of one of our Western railways, a note of its valuable contents was sent to the clearinghouse in London. This was recorded in a book, as all inquiries after lost property, wheresoever made throughout the kingdom, are also forwarded to the clearinghouse. It follows that the notes of losses and notes of inquiries meet, and thus the lost and the losers are brought together and reunited with a facility that would be impracticable without such a central agency. In the case of our diamond ring, however, no proper inquiry had been made. Consequently, there was only the loss recorded on the books of the clearinghouse. While Edwin was pondering this matter, a note was put into his hands by a junior clerk. It contained an inquiry after a diamond ring which had been wrapped up in a large brown paper parcel, with the name Derby written on it in pencil, and was lost many months before between Clatterby and London. The note further set forth that the ring was the property of Mrs. Tipps of Eden Villa, and enclosed from that lady a minute description of the ring. It was signed James Noble, M.D. "Wonderful!" exclaimed Edwin. "The most singular coincidence I ever experienced." Having thus delivered himself, he took the necessary steps to have the ring sent to London, and obtained leave, being an intimate friend of the Tipps family, to run down by train and deliver it. While he is away on this errand, we will take the opportunity of mounting his stool and jotting down a few particulars about the clearinghouse, which are worth knowing, for that establishment is not only an invaluable means of effecting such happy reunions of the lost and the losers as we have referred to, but is in many other ways one of the most important institutions of the kingdom. The Railway Clearinghouse is so named, we presume, because it clears up railway accounts that would, but for its intervention, become inextricably confused, and because it enables all the different lines in the country to interchange facilities for through booking traffic, and clears up their respective accounts in reference to the same. Something of the use and value of the clearinghouse may be shown at a glance by explaining that before the great schemes of amalgamation, which have now been carried out, each railway company booked passengers and goods only as far as its own rails went. And at this point, fresh tickets had to be taken out and carriages changed, with all the disagreeable accompaniments and delays of shifting luggage, etc. Before through booking was introduced, a traveler between London and Inverness was compelled to renew his ticket and change luggage 4 times between Darlington and Cardiff, 6 times. In some journeys, no fewer than 9 or 10 changes were necessary. This, as traffic increased, of course, became intolerable. It is quite certain that the present extent of passenger and goods traffic could never have been attained if the old system had continued. It was felt to be absolutely necessary that not only passengers, but carriages and goods must be passed over as many lines as possible at straight through to their destinations, with no needless delays and without breaking bulk. But how was this to be accomplished? There were difficulties in the way of through booking which do not appear at first sight. When, for instance, a traveler goes from London to Edinburgh by the East Coast route, he passes over 3 different railways of unequal length or mileage. The Great Northern furnishes his ticket and gives him station accommodation besides providing his carriage, while the Northeastern and North British permit him to run over their lines, and the latter also furnishes station accommodation and collects his ticket. To ascertain precisely how much of that traveler's fare is due to each company involves a careful and nice calculation. Besides this, the whole fare is paid to the Great Northern, and it would be unjust to expect that that company should be saddled with the trouble of making the calculation, and the expense of remitting its share to each of the other companies. So too with goods, one company furnishing the wagon and tarpaulin, besides undertaking the trouble of loading and furnishing station accommodation and the use of its line, while it may be several other companies give the use of their lines only, and that to a variable extent. In addition to all this, the company providing its carriage or wagons is entitled to demurrage for every day beyond a certain time that these are detained by the companies to which they do not belong. Now, if all this be unavoidable, even in the case of a single fare or a small parcel, it must be self-evident that in lines where the interchange of through traffic is great and constant, it would have been all but impossible for the railway companies to manage their business, and the system would have given rise to endless disputes. In order to settle accounts of this description, it was soon seen to be absolutely necessary that some sort of arrangement must be come to, and accordingly, the idea of a central office was conceived, and a system established without delay, which for minute detail and comprehensive grasp is unrivaled by any other institution. At first, only a few of the railway companies united in establishing the clearinghouse in 1842, but by degrees, as its immense value became known, other companies joined, and it now embraces all the leading companies in the kingdom. It is said to be not inferior to the War Office, Colonial Office, and Admiralty in regard to the amount of work it gets through in a year. Its accounts amount to some 12 millions sterling, yet they always must and do balance to a fraction of a farthing. There must never be a surplus and never a deficiency in its funds, for it can make no profits, being simply a thoroughly honest and disinterested and perfectly correct go-between, which adjusts the mutual obligations of railways in a quick and economical manner. Its accounts are balanced every month, and every pound, shilling, and penny can be accounted for. It annually receives and dispenses a revenue greater than that of many European kingdoms. In 1847, its gross receipts were only £793,701. In 1868, they had risen to above 11 millions. Each line connected with the clearinghouse has a representative on the committee to look after its interests and bears its proportion of the expenses of the establishment. Before showing the manner in which the work is performed for the railway companies, it may be well to premise that one great good which the clearinghouse system does to the public is to enable them to travel everywhere with as much facility as if there were only one railway and one company in the kingdom. To avoid going into too much detail, we may say briefly that in regard to goods, statements of through traffic dispatched are sent daily from thousands of stations to the clearinghouse. Also, separate statements of through traffic received. These are compared. Of those that are found to agree, each company is debited or credited as the case may be, with the proportion due to or by it. Where discrepancies occur, correspondence ensues until the thing is cleared up, and then the distribution to the accounts of the several companies takes place. As discrepancies are numerous and constant, correspondence is necessarily great. So minutely correct and particular are they at the clearinghouse that a shilling is sometimes divided between 4 companies. Even a penny is deemed worthy of being debited to one company and credited to another. As it is with goods, so is it with passengers. Through tickets are sent from all the stations to the clearinghouse, where they are examined and compared with the returns of the tickets issued, and then sent back to their respective companies. As these tickets amount to many thousands a day, some idea may be formed of the amount of labor bestowed on the examination of them. The proportions of each ticket due to each company are then credited, and statements of the same made out and forwarded to the several companies daily. From the 2 sets of returns forwarded to the clearinghouse, statements of the debit and credit balances are made out weekly. Parcels are treated much in the same way as the goods. Mileage is a branch of service which requires a separate staff of men. There are hundreds and thousands of wagons, loaded and empty, constantly running to and fro, day and night, on various lines to which they do not belong. Each individual wagon must be traced and accounted for to the clearinghouse from its start to its arrival and back again. And not only wagons, but even the individual tarpaulins that cover them are watched and noted in this way, in order that the various companies over whose lines they pass may get their due, and that the companies owning them may get their demurrage if they be improperly detained on the way. For this purpose, at every point where separate railways join, there are station men in the pay of the clearinghouse whose duty it is to take the numbers of all passenger carriages and goods, wagons and tarpaulins, and make a daily statement of the same to the clearinghouse. As daily returns of all foreign carriages arriving and departing from all clearinghouse stations are forwarded to the same office, they are thus in a position to check the traffic, detect discrepancies, and finally make the proper entries as to mileage and demurrage in the accounts of the respective companies. Frequently, the charge of 1/10 of a penny per mile for a tarpaulin is divided among several companies in various proportions. For a wagon or carriage from Edinburgh to London, mileage and demurrage accounts are sent out by the clearinghouse to 4 companies. Formerly, before demurrage was introduced, carriages were frequently detained on lines to which they did not belong for weeks and even months, until sometimes they were lost sight of altogether. Once a month, the balances are struck, and the various railways, instead of having to pay enormous sums to each other, obtain settlement by a means of comparatively small balances. For example, the London and North Western Railway sends its through passengers over the Caledonian Line. The mileage charged for its foreign carriages is 3 farthings per mile. Small though that sum is, it amounts, at the end of the month, perhaps to £5,000. This little bill is sent to the clearinghouse by the Caledonian against the London and North Western. But during that same period, the latter company has been running up a somewhat similar bill against the former company. Both accounts are sent into the clearinghouse. They amount together to perhaps some 15 or 20,000 pounds. Yet when one is set off against the other, a 10 or 20-pound note may be all that is required to change hands in order to balance the accounts. The total mileage of lines under the jurisdiction of the clearinghouse, and over which it exercises complete surveillance on every train that passes up or down, night or day, as far as regulating the various interests of the companies is concerned, amounts to more than 14,000. The Times, at the conclusion of a very interesting article on this subject, says, "Our whole railway system would be as nothing without the clearinghouse," which affords another illustration of the great truth that the British railway public is the best served railway public in the world, and, on the whole, the least grateful. We hope and incline to believe that in the latter remark, the great thunderer is wrong, and that it is only a small, narrow-minded, and ignorant section of the public which is ungrateful. Disputed claims between railways are referred to the arbitration of the Committee of the Clearinghouse, from whose decision there is no appeal. The trouble taken in connection with the lost luggage department is very great, written communications being sent to almost innumerable stations on various lines of rails for every inquiry that is made to the house after lost luggage. It is a striking commentary at once on the vast extent of traffic in the kingdom, and the great value in one important direction of this establishment: the fact that in 1 year the number of articles accounted for to the clearinghouse by stations as left by passengers, either on the platforms or in carriages, amounted to 156,769 trunks, bags, and parcels, and of these, nearly 95 in every 100 were restored through the clearinghouse to their owners. It is probable that the property thus restored would amount to $500,000 of money. This reminds us that we left Edwin Gurwood on his way to restore Mrs. Tipps her lost ring, and that, therefore, it is our duty to resume the thread of our story, with, of course, a humble apology to the patient reader for having again given way to our irresistible tendency to digress. Chapter 22, The Diamond Ring and the Railway Clearinghouse of the Iron Horse. Recording by Sarah Soirée. Las Vegas, Nevada. My website is www.fairyjanes.com. End of the Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine.
Chapter 22 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 22. Mrs. Tipps goes on a journey, and meets a gentleman who, with much assurance, comments freely on insurance. On a particular holiday it was advertised that a great excursion train would start from the Clatterby station at a certain hour. At the appointed time the long line of carriages was pushed up to the platform by our friend John Marrot, who was appointed that day to drive the train. "Bill," remarked John to his mate, "it'll be a biggish train. There's an uncommon lot of people on the platform." "They're pretty thick," replied Will Garvie, wiping his countenance with a piece of waste, which, while it removed the perspiration, left behind a good deal of oil, and streaked his nose with coal dust. But Will was not particular. The excursionists were indeed unusually numerous. It chanced to be a fine day, and the platform was densely crowded with human beings, many of whom moved, when movement was possible, in groups, showing that there were various sections that had a common aim and interest, and meant to keep together as much as possible. There were men there who had evidently made up their minds to a thoroughly enjoyable day, and women whose aspects were careworn but cheerful, to whom a holiday was probably a memorable event in the year. Of young people there was of course a considerable sprinkling, and amongst the crowd could be seen a number of individuals whose amused expression of countenance and general aspect bespoke them ordinary travellers, who meant to avail themselves of a cheap train. All classes and conditions of men, women, and children were hustling each other in a state of great excitement, but the preponderating class was that which is familiarly though not very respectfully styled the masses. Mrs Marrot was there too, much against her will, and little Gertie. A sister of the former, who lived about 20 miles from Clatterby, had, a short time before, made her husband a present of a fine fat pugilistic boy, and Mrs M felt constrained to pay her a visit. John was on the look-out for his wife and child, so was Will Garvie. The former waved a piece of cotton waste to her when she arrived. She caught sight of him and gave him a cheerful nod in reply, and an unexpressed blessing on his weather-beaten face arose in her heart as Garvie pushed through the crowd and conducted her and Gertie to a carriage. Timid little Mrs Tipps was also there. It is probable that no power on earth, save that of physical force, could have induced Mrs Tipps to enter an excursion train, for which above all other sorts of trains she entertained a species of solemn horror. But the excitement consequent on the unexpected recovery of the diamond ring, and the still more unexpected accession of wealth consequent thereon, had induced her to smother her dislike to railways for a time, and avail herself of their services in order to run down to a town about 20 miles off, for the purpose of telling the good news to Netta, who chanced to be on a short visit to a friend there at the time. When Mrs Tipps reached the station, her ignorance of railway matters, and the confused mental state which was her normal condition, prevented her from observing that the train was an excursion one. She therefore took out a first-class ticket, and also an insurance ticket for £500, for which latter she paid sixpence. Her ignorance and perturbation also prevented her from observing that this rate of insurance was considerably higher than she was accustomed to pay, owing to the fact of the train being an excursion one. If she had been going by an ordinary train, she could have insured £1,000 first class for 3d., half that sum second class for 2d., and £200 third class for the ridiculously small sum of 1d. Good Mrs Tipps held the opinion so firmly that accident was the usual, and all but inevitable, accompaniment of railway travelling, that she invariably insured her life when compelled to undertake a journey. It was of no avail that her son Joseph pointed out to her that accidents were in reality few and far between, and that they bore an excessively small proportion to the numbers of journeys undertaken annually. Mrs Tipps was not to be moved. In regard to that subject she had, to use one of her late husband's phrases, nailed her colours to the mast, and could not haul them down even though she would. She therefore, when about to undertake a journey, invariably took out an insurance ticket, as we have said, and this solely with the views to Netta's future benefit. We would not have it supposed that we object here to the principle of insuring against accident. On the contrary, we consider that principle to be a wise one, and, in some cases, one that becomes almost a duty. When Mrs Tipps discovered that Mrs Marrot and Gertie were going by this same train, she was so much delighted at the unlooked-for companionship that she at once entered the third class, where they sat, and began to make herself comfortable beside them. But presently, recollecting that she had a first-class ticket, she started up and insisted on Mrs Marrot and Gertie going first class along with her, saying that she would pay the difference. Mrs Marrot remonstrated, but Mrs Tipps, strong in her natural liberality of spirit, which had been rather wildly set free by her recent good fortune, would not be denied. "You must come with me, Mrs Marrot," she said. "I'm so frightened in railways, you have no idea what a relief it is to me to have anyone near me whom I know. I will change your tickets. Let me have them, quick. We have no time to lose. There. Now wait till I return. Oh, I forgot your insurance tickets." "Why, bless you, ma'am, we never insures." "You never insure!" exclaimed Mrs Tipps in amazement. "And it only costs you 3d. for £1000." "Well, I don't know nothing as to that," said Mrs Marrot. Before she could finish the sentence Mrs Tipps was gone. She returned in breathless haste, beckoned Mrs Marrot and Gertie to follow her, and was finally hurried with them into a first-class carriage, just as the train began to move. Their only other companion in the carriage was a stout little old gentleman, with a bright complexion, speaking eyes, and the countenance in which benevolence appeared to struggle with enthusiasm for the mastery. He was obviously one of those men who delight in conversation, and he quickly took an opportunity of engaging in it. Observing that Mrs Tipps presented an insurance ticket to each of her companions, he said, "I am glad to see, madam, that you are so prudent as to insure the lives of your friends." "I always insure my own life," replied Mrs Tipps with a little smile, "and feel it incumbent on me at least to advise my friends to do the same." Quite right, madam," replied the enthusiastic little man, applying his handkerchief to his bald pate with such energy that it shone like a billiard ball. "Quite right, madam. I only wish that the public at large were equally alive to the great value of insurance against accident. Why, ma'am, it's a duty, a positive duty," here he addressed himself to Mrs Marrot, "to insure one's life against accident." "Oh la, sir, is it?" said Mrs Marrot quite earnestly. "Yes, it is. Why, look here. This is your child?" He laid his hand gently on Gertie's head. "Yes, sir, she is." "Well, my good woman, suppose that you are a widow and are killed." Mrs Marrot looked as if she would rather not suppose anything of the sort. "What, I ask, what becomes of your child? Left a beggar, an absolute beggar." He looked quite triumphantly at Mrs Tipps and her companions, and waited a few seconds as if to allow the idea to exert its full force on them. "But, sir," observed Mrs Marrot meekly, "supposing that there do be an accident," she shivered a little, "that ticket won't prevent me being killed, you know." "No, ma'am, no, but it will prevent your sweet daughter from being left a beggar, that is, on the supposition that you are a widow." "Which I ain't, sir, I'm happy to say," remarked Mrs Marrot. "But, sir, supposing we was both of us killed." She paused abruptly, as if she had committed a sin in merely giving utterance to the idea. "Why, then your other children would get the £500, or your heirs, whoever they may be. It's a splendid system, that, of insurance against accident. Just look at me, now." He spread out his hands and displayed himself, looking from one to the other as if he were holding up to admiration something rare and beautiful. "Just look at me. I'm off on a tour of 3 months through England, Scotland, and Ireland, not for my health, madam, as you may see, but for scientific purposes. Well, what do? I go to the Railway Passengers Assurance Company's office, 64 Cornhill, London. I like to be particular, you see, as become one who professes to be an amateur student of the exact sciences. And I take out what they call a short-term policy of insurance against accidents of all kinds, for £1,000, £1,000, observe, for which I pay the paltry sum of 30 shillings, £1 10 shillings. Well, what then? Away I go, leaving behind me with perfect indifference a wife and 2 little boys. Remarkable little boys, madam, I assure you. Perfect marvels of health and intelligence, both of them. 2 little boys, madam, which have not been equalled since Cain and Abel were born. Every one says so, with the exception of a few of the cynical and jaundiced among men and women. And, pray, why am I so indifferent? Just because they are provided for. They have a moderately good income secured to them as it is, and the £1,000 which I have insured on my life will render it a competence in the event of my being killed. It will add £50 a year to their income, which happens to be the turning point of comfort. And what of myself? Why, with a perfectly easy conscience, I may go and do what I please. If I get drowned in Loch Katrine, what matter? If I break my neck in the Gap of Dunloe, what matter? If I get lost and frozen on the steeps of Ben Nevis or Goat Fell, what matter? If I am crushed to death in a railway accident, or get entangled in machinery and am torn to atoms, still I say, what matter? £1,000 must at once be paid down to my widow and children, and all because of the pitiful sum of 30 shillings. But suppose, continued the enthusiastic man, deepening his tone as he became more earnest, suppose that I am not killed, but only severely injured and mangled so as to be utterly unfit to attend to my worldly affairs, what then? Mrs Tipps shuddered to think of what then. Why, continued the enthusiastic gentleman, I shall in that case be allowed from the company £6 a week until recovered, or, in the event of my sinking under my injuries within 3 months after the accident, the whole sum of £1,000 will be paid to my family. Mrs Tipps smiled and nodded her head approvingly, but Mrs Marrot still looked dubious. "But, sir," she said, "supposing you don't get either hurt or killed?" "Why, then," replied the elderly gentleman, "and only 50 shillings out of pocket, which, you must admit, is but a trifling addition to the expenses of a 3 months' tour. Besides, have I not had 3 months of an easy mind, and of utter regardlessness as to my life and limbs? Have not my wife and boys had 3 months of easy mind and indifference to my life and limbs also? Is not all that cheaply purchased at 30 shillings, while the sum itself, I have the satisfaction of knowing, goes to increase the funds of that excellent company which enables you and me and thousands of others to become so easy-minded and reckless, and which, at the same time, pays its fortunate shareholders a handsome dividend?" "Really, sir," said Mrs Tipps, laughing, "you talk so enthusiastically of this insurance company that I almost suspect you to be a director of it." "Madam," replied the elderly gentleman with some severity, "if I were a director of it, which I grieve to say I am not, I should only be doing my simple duty to it, and to you, in thus urging it on your attention. But I am altogether uninterested in it, except as a philanthropist. I see and feel that it does good to myself and to my fellow men, therefore I wish my fellow men to appreciate it more highly than they do, for it not only insures against accident by railway, but against all kinds of accidents, while its arrangements are made to suit the convenience of the public in every possible way. Why, madam," he continued, kindling up again and polishing his head violently, "only think, for the small sum of £4 paid annually, it insures that you shall have paid to your family, if you chance to be killed, the sum of £1,000, or, if not killed, £6 a week while you are totally laid up, and £1 10s. a week while you are only partially disabled. And yet, would you believe it, many persons who seek the value of this, and begin the wise course of insurance, go on for only a few years, and then foolishly give it up, disappointed, I presume, that no accident has happened to them. See, here is one of their pamphlets." He pulled a paper out of his pocket energetically, and put on a pair of gold spectacles, through which he looked when consulting the pamphlet, and over which he glanced when observing the effect of what he read on Mrs Tipps. "What do I find, eh? Ha, yes, here it is. A Cornish auctioneer pushed back a window shutter. These are the very words, madam. What more did he do than that shutter, or what it did to him, is not told. But he must have come by some damage, because he received £55. A London clerk got his eye injured by a hairpin in his daughter's hair. How suggestive is that, madam? What a picture it calls up of a wearied, toil-worn man fondling his child of an evening, pressing his cheek to her fair head. And what a commentary it is," he became very stern here, "on the use of such barbarous implements as hairpins." "I am not punning, madam. I am much too serious to pun. I should have used the word savage instead of barbarous. Now, what was the result? This company gave that clerk compensation to the extent of £26. Again, a medical practitioner fell through the floor of a room. It must have been a bad, as it certainly was a strange, fall. Probably he was heavy and the floor decayed. At all events, that fall procured him £120. A Cardiff agent was bathing his feet. Why, we are not told, but imagination is not slow to comprehend the reason, when the severity of our climate is taken into account. He broke the foot-pan, a much less comprehensible thing, and the breaking of that foot-pan did him damage, for which he was compensated with £52 16s. Again, a merchant of Birkenhead was paid £20 for playing with his children. "Dear me, sir!" exclaimed Mrs Marrot in surprise. "Surely—" "Of course, my good woman," said the elderly gentleman. "You are to understand that he came by some damage while doing so. But I give you the exact words of the pamphlet. It were desirable that a little more information had been given just to gratify our curiosity. Now these that I have read are under the head of accidents at home. Under other heads we find a farmer suffocated by the falling in of a sand-pit, for which his representatives received £1,000. Another 1,000 is paid to the heirs of a poor dyer who fell into a vat of boiling liquor. While in regard to smaller matters, a warehouseman whose finger caught in the cog-wheel of a crane received £30. And again, here is £1,000 to a gentleman killed in a railway accident, and £100 to a poor woman. The latter had insured for a single trip in an excursion train at a charge of 2d, while the former had a policy of insurance extending over a considerable period, for which he probably paid 20 or 30 shillings. These are but samples, madam, of the good service rendered to sorrowing humanity by this assurance company, which, you must observe, makes no pretensions to philanthropic aims, but is based simply on business principles. And I find that the total amount of compensation paid in this manner during 1 year by this company amounts to about £72,000. As Mrs Marrot yawned at this point, and Mrs Tipps appeared somewhat mystified, the enthusiastic gentleman smiled, put away his pamphlet, and wisely changed the subject. He commented on the extreme beauty of the weather, and how fortunate this state of things was for the people who went to the country for a day's enjoyment. Thus pleasantly he whiled away the time, and ingratiated himself with Gertie until they arrived at the station, where Mrs Tipps and Mrs Marrot had to get out, and where many of the excursionists got out along with them. While the former went their several ways, arranging to meet in the evening and return together by the same train, the latter scattered themselves over the neighbouring common and green fields, and sitting down under the hedgerows among the wild flowers, picnicked in the sunshine, or wandered about the lanes, enjoying the song of birds and scent of flowers, and wishing perchance that their lot had been cast among the green pastures of the country, rather than amid the din and smoke and turmoil of the town. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 23. Details a terrible accident. In due time that holiday came to a close, and the excursionists returned to the station where their train awaited them. Among the rest came Mrs Tipps and Mrs Marrot, but they did not arrive together, and therefore, much to their annoyance, failed to get into the same carriage. The weather, which up to that time had kept fine, began to lower, and, just as the train started, a smart thunder shower fell, but, being under cover, the holiday makers heeded it not. Upon the whole they were an orderly band of excursionists. Some of the separate groups were teetotalers, and only one or two showed symptoms of having sought to increase their hilarity by use of stimulants. When the shower began, John Marrot and his mate put on their pilot cloth coats, for the screen that formed their only protection from the weather was a thin flat one, without roof or sides, forming only a partial protection from wind and rain. Night had begun to descend before the train left the station, and as the lowering clouds overspread the sky, the gloom rapidly increased until it became quite dark. "We are going to have a bad night of it," observed John Marrot as his mate examined the water gauge. "Looks like it," was Garvie's curt reply. The clatter of the engine and howling of the wind, which had by that time risen to a gale, rendered conversation difficult. The two men therefore confined themselves to the few occasional words that were requisite for the proper discharge of their duties. It was not a night on which the thoughts of an engine driver were likely to wander much. To drive an excursion train in a dark night through a populous country over a line which was crowded with traffic, while the rain beat violently on the little round windows in the screen, obscuring them and rendering it difficult to keep a good lookout, was extremely anxious work, which claimed the closest and most undivided attention. Nevertheless, the thoughts of John Marrot did wander a little that night to the carriage behind him in which were his wife and child, but this wandering of thought caused him to redouble rather than to relax his vigilance and caution. Will Garvie consulted the water gauge for a moment and then opened the iron door of the furnace in order to throw in more coal. The effect would have stirred the heart of Rembrandt. The instantaneous blinding glare of the intense fire shot through the surrounding darkness, lighting up the two men and the tender as if all were made of red-hot metal, flooding the smoke and steam clouds overhead with round masses and curling lines of more subdued light, and sending sharp gleams through the murky atmosphere into dark space beyond, where the ghostly landscape appeared to rush wildly by. Now it chanced that at that part of the line they had reached, a mineral train which had preceded them had been thrown off the rails by a bale of goods which had fallen from a previous goods train. Carelessness on the part of those who had loaded the truck, from which the bale had fallen, led to this accident. The driver and fireman of the mineral train were rather severely hurt, and the guard was much shaken as well as excited, so that they neglected to take the proper precaution of sending back one of their number to stop the train that followed them. This would have been a matter of little consequence had the line been worked on the block system, because, in that case, the danger signal would have been kept up, and would have prevented the excursion train from entering on that portion of the line until it was signalled "clear." But the block system had been only partially introduced on the line. A sufficient interval of time had been allowed after the mineral train had passed the last station, and then, as we have seen, the excursion train was permitted to proceed. Thus it came to pass that at a part of the line where there was a slight curve and a deep cutting, John Marrot, looking anxiously through his circular window, saw the red tail light of the mineral train. Instantly he cried, "Clap on the brakes, Bill!" Almost at the same moment he reversed the engine and opened the whistle to alarm the guard, who applied his brakes in violent haste. But it was too late. The speed could not be checked in time. The rails were slippery, owing to rain. Almost at full speed they dashed into the mineral train with a noise like thunder. The result was appalling. The engine was smashed and twisted in a manner that is quite indescribable, and the tender was completely turned over, while the driver and fireman were shot as if from a cannon's mouth, high into the air. The first two carriages of the passenger train, and the last van of the mineral, were completely wrecked, and over these the remaining carriages of the passenger train were piled until they reached an incredible height. The guard's van was raised high in the air, with its ends resting on a third-class carriage, which at one end was completely smashed in by the van. At the time of the concussion, just after the terrible crash, there was a brief, strange, unearthly silence. All was still for a few seconds, and passengers who were uninjured gazed at each other in mute and horrified amazement. But death in that moment had passed upon many, while others were fearfully mangled. The silence was almost immediately broken by the cries and groans of the wounded. Some had been forcibly thrown out of the carriages, others had their legs and arms broken, and some were jammed into fixed positions from which death alone had relieved them. The scenes that followed were heartrending. Those who were uninjured, or only slightly hurt, lent willing aid to extricate their less fortunate fellow travellers, but the howling of the night, the deluging rain, and the darkness of the night retarded their efforts, and in many cases rendered them unavailing. John Marrot, who, as we have said, was shot high into the air, fell by good fortune into a large bush. He was stunned at first, but otherwise uninjured. On regaining consciousness, the first thoughts that flashed across him were his wife and child. Rising in haste he made his way towards the engine, which was conspicuous not only by its own fire, but by reason of several other fires which had been kindled in various places to throw light on the scene. In the wreck and confusion, It was difficult to find out the carriage in which Mrs Marrot had travelled, and the people about were too much excited to give very coherent answers to questions. John therefore made his way to a knot of people who appeared to be tearing up the debris at a particular point. He found Joe Turner, the guard there with his head bandaged and his face covered with blood. "I've been looking for 'ee everywhere, John," said Joe. "She's there," he added, pointing to a mass of broken timbers which belonged to a carriage, on the top of which the guard's van had been thrown, crushing it almost flat. John did not require to ask the meaning of his words. The guard's look was sufficiently significant. He said not a word, but the deadly pallor of his countenance showed how much he felt. Springing at once at the broken carriage, and seizing an axe from the hand of a man who appeared exhausted by his efforts, he began to cut through the planking so as to get at the interior. At intervals a half-stifled voice was heard crying piteously for John. "Keep up heart, lass," said John, in his deep, strong voice. "I'll get thee out before long, God helping me." Those who stood by lent their best aid, but anxious though they were about the fate of those who lay buried beneath that pile of rubbish, they could not help casting an occasional look of wonder, amounting almost to awe, on the tall form of the engine driver, as he cut through and tore up the planks and beams with a power that seemed little short of miraculous. Presently he stopped and listened intently for a moment, while the perspiration rolled in big drops from his brow. "Dost hear me, Mary?" he asked, in a deeply anxious tone. If any reply were uttered it was drowned by the howling of the wind and the noise of the workmen. Again he repeated the question in an agonizing cry. His wife did not reply, but Gertie's sweet little voice was heard saying faintly, "I think mother is dead. Oh, take us out, dear father, take us out, quick!" Again John Marrot bowed himself to the task, and exerting his colossal strength to the utmost, continued to tear up and cast aside the broken planks and beams. The people around him, now thoroughly aroused to the importance of haste, worked with all their might, and, ere long, they reached the floor of the carriage, where they found mother and child jammed into a corner and arched over by a huge mass of broken timber. It was this mass that had saved them, for the rest of the carriage had been literally crushed into splinters. Close beside them was discovered the headless trunk of a young man, and the dead body of a girl who had been his companion that day. Gertie was the first taken out. Her tender little frame seemed to have yielded to the pressure and thus escaped, for, excepting a scratch or two, she was uninjured. John Marrot did not pause to indulge in any expression of feeling. He sternly handed her to the bystanders, and went on powerfully but carefully removing the broken timbers and planks, until he succeeded in releasing his wife. Then he raised her in his arms, staggered with her to a neighbouring bank, and laid her down. Poor Mrs Marrot was crushed and bruised terribly. Her clothes were torn, and her face was so covered with dust and blood as to be quite unrecognizable at first. John said not a word, but went down on his knees and began carefully to wipe away the blood from her features, in which act he was assisted by the drenching rain. Sad though his case was, there was no one left to help him. The cries of the unfortunate sufferer, still unextricated, drew everyone else away the moment the poor woman had been released. Ere long the whole scene of the catastrophe was brilliantly illuminated by the numerous fires which were kindled out of the debris, to serve as torches to those who laboured might and main for the deliverance of the uninjured. Troops of people from the surrounding district quickly made their appearance on the scene, and while some of these lent effective aid in the work of the rescue, others brought blankets, water, and spirits to cover and comfort those who stood so much in need of help. As the wounded were got out and laid upon the banks of the line, several surgeons busied themselves in examining and binding their wounds, and the spot bore resemblance to a battlefield after the tide of war had passed over it. 17 dead and 150 injured already lay upon the wet ground, while many of the living, who went about with blanched, solemn faces, yet with earnest, helpful energy, were bruised and cut badly enough to have warranted their retiring from the spot, and having their own cases considered. Meanwhile a telegram had been sent to Clatterby, and in a short time a special train arrived with several of the chief men of the line, and a gang of 100 surface men to clear away the wreck and remove the dead and injured. Many of those unhurt had made singularly narrow escapes. One man was seated in a third-class carriage when the concussion took place. The side of the carriage fell out, and he slid down on the rails just as the other carriages and vans piled up on the place he had left, killing or wounding all his fellow travellers. Beneath the rubbish next the tender, a mother and child were buried and several others. All were dead save the mother and child when the man began to dig them out, and before they succeeded in their labours the mother had died also, though the child survived. In another carriage, or rather under it, a lad was seen lying with a woman's head crushed down on his breast and an infant beside her. They had to saw the carriage asunder before these could be extricated. The woman died almost immediately upon being released, but the lad and infant were uninjured. Elsewhere a young girl, who had attracted attention by the sweet expression of her face, had been strangled. In another case the surface men attempted to extricate a woman by sawing the broken carriage, under which she lay, but the more they sawed the more did the splinters appear to cling round her, and when at last they got her out she was dead, while another passenger in the same carnage escaped without a scratch. We would not prolong a painful description which may, perhaps, be thought too long already, yet within certain limits it is right that men should know what their fellows suffer. After all the passengers had been removed to the special train, the dead into vans and horse boxes and the living into carriages, the surface men set to work to clear the line. Poor Mrs Tipps was among the rescued, and, along with the others, was sent on to the Clatterby station by the special train. While the people were being placed in this train, John Marrot observed Edwin Gurwood in the crowd. He chanced to be at Clatterby when the telegram of the accident arrived, and ran down in the special train to render assistance. "I'm glad to see you, sir," he said in a low, earnest voice. "My mate, Bill Garvie, must be badly hurt, for he's nowhere to be found. He must be under the wreck somewheres. I wouldn't leave the spot till I found him in ordinary circumstances, but my Mary—" He stopped abruptly. "I hope Mrs Marrot is not hurt?" said Edwin anxiously. John could not reply at first. He shook his head and pointed to a carriage near at hand. "She's there, sir, with Gertie." "Gertie!" exclaimed Edwin. "Ay, poor thing, Gertie is all right, thank the good Lord for that, but—" Again he stopped, then with an effort continued, "I couldn't quit them, you know, till I've got 'em safe home. But my mind will be easy, Mr Gurwood, if you'll look after Bill. We was both throwed a good way from the engine, but I couldn't rightly say where. You'll not refuse—" "My dear Marrot," said Edwin, interrupting him and grasping his hand, "you may rely on me. I shall not leave the ground till he is found and cared for." "Thank'ee, sir, thank'ee," said John, in some of his wonted hearty tone, as he returned Edwin's squeeze of the hand and hastened to the train, which was just ready to start. Edwin went at once to the spot where the surface men were toiling at the wreck in the fitful light of the fires, which flared wildly in the storm, and, as they had by that time gathered intense heat, bid defiance to the rain. There were several passengers, who had just been extricated, lying on the ground, some motionless as if dead, others talking incoherently. These he looked at in passing, but Garvie was not among them. Leaving them under the care of the surgeons, who did all that was possible in the circumstances for their relief, he ran and joined the surface men in removing the broken timbers of a carriage, from beneath which groans were heard. With some difficulty a woman was extricated and laid tenderly on the bank. Just then Edwin observed a guard, with whom he was acquainted, and asked him if the fireman had yet been found. "Not yet, sir, I believe," said the man. "They say that he and the driver were flung to one side of the line." Edwin went towards the engine, and, judging the probable direction and distance to which a man might be thrown in such an accident, went to a certain spot and sought carefully around it in all directions. For some time he sought in vain, and was on the point of giving up in despair, when he observed a cap lying on the ground. Going up to it, he saw the form of a man, half concealed by a mass of rubbish. He stooped, and, raising the head a little, tried to make out the features, but the light of the fires did not penetrate to the spot. He laid him down gently again, and was about to hasten away for assistance when the man groaned and said faintly, "Is that you, Jack?" "No, my poor fellow," said Edwin, stooping down. "Are you badly hurt? I was just going to fetch help to—" "Mr Gurwood," said the man, interrupting, "you don't seem to know me. I'm Garvie, the fireman. Where am I? Surely there's something wrong with my left arm. Oh! I remember now. Is Jack safe? And the missus and Gertie, are they—" "Don't exert yourself," interrupted Edwin, as Will attempted to rise. "You must keep quiet until I fetch a doctor. Perhaps you're not much hurt, but it is well to be careful. Will you promise me to be still?" "All right, sir," said Will promptly. Edwin hastened for assistance, and in a short time the fireman was carried to a place of comparative shelter and his wounds examined. Almost immediately after the examination Edwin knelt at his side, and signed to those around him to retire. "Garvie," he said, in a low kind voice, I'm sorry to tell you that the doctors say you must lose your left arm." Will looked intently in Edwin's face. "Is there no chance of saving it?" he asked earnestly. "It might never be much to speak of, sir, but I'd rather run some risk than lose it." Edwin shook his head. "No," he said sadly, "they tell me amputation must be immediately. Otherwise your life may be sacrificed. I said I would like to break it to you, but it is necessary, my poor fellow, that you should make up your mind at once." "God's will be done," said Will in a low voice. "I'm ready, sir." The circumstances did not admit of delay. In a few minutes the fireman's left arm was amputated above the elbow, the stump dressed, and himself laid in as sheltered a position as possible to wait the return of the train that was to convey the dead and wounded, more recently extricated, to Clatterby. When that train arrived at the station it was touching to witness the pale anxious faces that crowded the platform as the doors were opened and the dead and sufferers carried out. To hear the cries of agony when the dead were recognized, and the cries of grief, strangely, almost unnaturally, mingled with joy, when some who were supposed to have been killed were carried out alive. Some were seen almost fondling the dead with a mixture of tender love and abject despair. Others bent over them with a strange stare of apparent insensibility, or looked round on the pitying bystanders inquiringly, as if they would say, "Surely, surely, this cannot be true." The sensibilities of some were stunned, so that they moved calmly about and gave directions in a quiet solemn voice, as if the great agony of grief were long past, though it was painfully evident that it had not yet begun, because the truth had not yet been realized. Among those who were calm and collected, though heart-stricken and deadly pale, was Lou Marrot. She had been sent to the station by her father to await the arrival of the train, with orders to bring Will Garvie home. When Will was carried out and laid on the platform alive, an irresistible gush of feeling overpowered her. She did not give way to noisy demonstration, as too many did, but knelt hastily down, raised his head on her knee, and kissed his face passionately. "Bless you, my darling," said Will, in a low thrilling voice, in which intense feeling struggled with a desire to make light of his misfortune. "God has sent a cordial that the doctors haven't got to give." "Oh, William!" exclaimed Loo, removing the hair from his forehead, but Loo could say no more. "Tell me, darling," said Garvie in an anxious tone, "is father safe, and mother, and Gertie?" "Father is safe, thank God," replied Loo with a choking voice, "and Gertie also, but mother—" "She is not dead?" exclaimed the fireman. "No, not dead, but very, very much hurt. The doctors fear she may not survive it, Will." No more was said, for at that moment 4 porters came up with a stretcher and placed Garvie gently upon it. Loo covered him with her shawl, a piece of tarpaulin was thrown over all, and thus he was slowly borne away to John Marrot's home. Chapter 23. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles.
Chapter 24 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Holtz. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 24. Results of the Accident. Years passed away, as years inevitably must, and many important changes took place in the circumstances and the management of the Grand National Trunk Railway, but the results of that terrible accident did not quickly pass away. As we have said, it cost Will Garvie an arm, and nearly cost Mrs. Marrot her life. We have much pleasure, however, in recording that it did not make the full charge in this matter. A very small modicum of life was left in that estimable woman, and on the strength of that, with her wonted vigor of character and invincibility of purpose, she set to work to draw out, as it were, a new lease of life. She succeeded to admiration, so much so, in fact, that but for 1 or 2 scars on her countenance, no one could have known that she had come by an accident at all. Bob Marrot was wont to say of her in her after years that, if it had been his mother who had lost an arm instead of Will Garvie, he was convinced that a firmness amounting almost to obstinacy of purpose would have enabled her to grow on a new arm as good as old un, if not better. We need scarcely add that Bob was an irreverent scamp. Poor Will Garvie! His was a sad loss, yet, strange to say, he rejoiced over it. "Why, you see," he used to say to Bob Marrot, Bob and he being great and confidential friends, You see, Bob, if it hadn't been for that accident, I never would have been laid up and brought so low, so very nigh to the grave, never would have knowed what it was to be nursed by your sister too. And so my eyes might have never been opened to half a goodness and tenderness, don't you see? No, Bob, I don't grudge having had my eyes opened by the loss of an arm. It was done cheap at the price. Of course I know Lou pretty well by this time, for a few years of married life is apt to clear a good deal of dust out of one's eyes. But I do assure you, Bob, that I never could have known it properly but for accident, which is the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. And then, you see, I'm just as able to work these here points with one arm as with two. To which Bob would reply, You're a queer fish, Bill. Hows'ever, every man's got a right to his own opinions. Will Garvey was a pointsman now. On recovering from his prolonged illness, during which he had been supported out of the Provident Fund of the railway, to which he and all the other men on the line contributed, he was put to light work at first at the station of Clatterby. By degrees his strength returned, and he displayed so much intelligence, and such calmness of nerve and coolness of courage, that he was made a pointsman at the station, and had a sentry-box sort of erection, with windows all round it, apportioned to his daily use. There he was continually employed in shifting the points for the shunting of trains, none of which dared to move, despite their mighty power and impatience, until Will Garvey gave them leave. To John Merritt, the accident, although not severe at first, had proved more damaging in the long run. No bones had been broken, or limbs lost, but John had received a shake so bad that he did not resume his duties with the same vigor as heretofore. He continued to stick to his post, however, for several years, and before giving it up, had the pleasure of training his son Bob in the situation which Garvey had been obliged to resign. Bob's heart, you see, had been all along set on driving the Lightning. He therefore gladly left the works when old enough, and when the opportunity offered, to fill the preliminary post of fireman. During this period, Edwin Gurwood rose to a responsible and sufficiently lucrative situation in the clearing-house. At the same time he employed much of his leisure in cultivating the art of painting, of which he was passionately fond. At first he painted for pleasure, but he soon found, on exhibiting one or two of his works, that picture dealers were willing to purchase from him. He therefore began to paint for profit, and succeeded so well that he began to save and lay by money, with a view to that wife with the nut-brown hair and the large lustrous eyes, who haunted his dreams by night and became his guiding star by day. Seeing him thus wholly immersed in the acquisition of money, and not knowing his motive, his faithful little friend Joe Tipps one day amazed and half offended him by reminding him that he had a soul to be cared for as well as a body. The arrow was tenderly shot, and with a trembling hand, but Joe prayed that it might be sent home, and it was. From that date Edwin could not rest. He reviewed his life. He reflected that everything he possessed, or hoped for, came to him, or was to come, from God. Yet as far as he could make out, he saw no evidence of the existence of religion in himself, save in the one fact that he regularly went to church on Sundays. He resolved to turn over a new leaf. Tried, and failed. He was perplexed, for he had tried honestly. "Tipps," he said one day, "you are the only man I ever could make a confidant of. To say truth, I'm not given to being very communicative as to personal matters at any time, but I must tell you that the remark you made about my soul the other day has stuck to me, and I have tried to lead a Christian life, but without much success." "Perhaps," said Tipps timidly, "it is because you have not yet become a Christian." "My dear fellow," exclaimed Edwin, "is not leading a Christian life becoming a Christian?" "Don't you think," said Tipps in an apologetic tone, "that leading a Christian life is rather the result of having become a Christian? It seems to me that you have been taking the plan of putting yourself and your doings first, and our Saviour last." We need not prolong a conversation referring to the old story, which ran very much in the usual groove. Suffice it to say that Edwin at last carefully consulted the Bible as to the plan of redemption, and, in believing, found that rest of spirit which he had failed to work out. Thenceforward he had a higher motive for laboring at his daily toil, yet the old motive did not lose, but rather gained in power by the change, whereby he realized the truth that godliness is profitable for the life that now is, as well as that which is to come. At last the painting became so successful that Edwin resolved to trust to it alone, said good-bye to the clearing-house with regret, for he left many a pleasant companion and several intimate friends behind him, and went to Clatterby, in the suburbs of which he took and furnished a small villa. Then it was that he came to the conclusion that the time had arrived to make a pointed appeal to the nut-brown hair and lustrous eyes. He went off and called at Captain Lee's house accordingly. The captain was out. Miss Lee was at home. Edwin entered the house, but he left all his native courage and self-possession on the doorstep outside. Being ushered into the drawing-room, he found Emma reading. From that moment, to his own surprise, and according to his own statement, he became an ass. The metamorphosis was complete. Ovid, had he been alive, would have rejoiced in it. He blushed more than a poor boy caught in his first grievous offence. The very straightforwardness of his character helped to make him worse. He felt, in all its importance, the momentous character of the step he was about to take, and he felt in all its strength the love with which his heart was full, and the inestimable value of the prize at which he aimed. No wonder that he was overwhelmed. The reader will observe that we have not attempted to dilate in this book on the value of that prize. Emma, like many other good people, is only incidental to our subject. We have been obliged to leave her to the reader's imagination. After all, what better could we have done? Imagination is more powerful in this matter than description. Neither one or other could, we felt, approach the reality. Therefore imagination was best. "Emma," he said, sitting down on the sofa beside her, and seizing her hand in both of his. "Mr. Gurwood!" she exclaimed in some alarm. Beginning, from the mere force of habit, some half-delirious reference to the weather, Edwin suddenly stopped, passed his fingers wildly through his hair, and again said, with deep earnestness, "Emma." Emma looked down, blushed, and said nothing. "Emma," he said again, "my good angel, my guiding star by night and by day. For years I have—" At that moment Captain Lee entered the room. Edwin leaped up and stood erect. Emma buried her face in the sofa cushions. "Edwin! Mr. Gurwood!" exclaimed Captain Lee. This was the beginning of a conversation which terminated eventually in the transference of the nut-brown hair and lustrous eyes to the artist's villa in Clatterby. As there was a good garden round the villa, and the wife with nut-brown hair was uncommonly fond of flowers, Edwin looked out for a gardener. It was at this identical time that John Marrot resolved to resign a situation as engine-driver on the Grand National Trunk Railway. Edwin, knowing that he had imbibed a considerable amount of knowledge of gardening from Lou, at once offered to employ him as his gardener. John gladly closed with the offer, and thus it came about that he and his wife removed to the villa, and left their old railway-ridden cottage in possession of Will and Lou, or, to be more correct, Mr. and Mrs. Garvey, and all the young Garveys. But what of timid Mrs. Tipps? The great accident did little for her beyond shaking her nervous system, and confirming her in the belief that railways were unutterably detestable, that she was not quite sure whether or not they were sinful, that, come what might, she never would enter one again, and that she felt convinced that she had been born 100 years too late, in which latter opinion most of her friends agreed with her, although they were glad, considering her lovable disposition, that the mistake had occurred. Netta did not take quite such an extreme view, and Joseph laughed at and quizzed them both, in an amiable sort of fashion, on their views. Among all the sufferers by that accident, few suffered so severely, with the exception, of course, of those who lost their lives, as the Grand National Trunk Railway itself. In the course of the trials that followed, it was clearly shown that the company had run the train much more with the view of gratifying the public than of enriching their coffers, from the fact that the utmost possible sum which they could hope to draw by it was £17, for which sum they had carried 600 passengers upwards of 20 miles. The accident took place in consequence of circumstances over which the company had no control, and the results were that 20 persons were killed and about 200 wounded, that 160 claims were made for compensation, 140 of which, being deemed exorbitant or fraudulent, were defended in court, and that eventually the company had to pay from £70,000 to £80,000, out of which the highest sum paid to one individual was £6,750. The risks that are thus run by railway companies will be seen to be excessive, especially when it is considered that excursion trains afford but slight remuneration, while many of them convey enormous numbers of passengers. On the occasion of the first excursion from Oxford to London, in 1851, 52 of the broad-gauge carriages of the Great Western were employed, and the excursionists numbered upwards of 3,500, a very town on wheels. Truly, the risks of railway companies are great, and their punishments severe. End of Chapter 24. Results of the accident. Recording by Sarah Holtz.
Chapter 25 of The Iron Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Wills. The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine. Chapter 25. The Last. A certain Christmas day approached. On the morning of the day preceding, Will Garvey, looking as broad and sturdy as ever, a perfect man, but for the empty sleeve, stood at his post near his sentry-box. His duties that day were severe. At that season of the year there is a great increase of traffic on all railways, and you may be sure that the Grand National Trunk Railway had its full share. On ordinary occasions about 300 trains passed Will Garvey's box, out and in during the 12 hours, but that day there had been nearly double the number of passengers, and a considerable increase in the number of trains that conveyed them, while goods trains had also increased greatly in bulk and in numbers. Garvey's box abutted on a bridge, and stood in the very midst of a labyrinth of intricate crossing lines, over which trains and pilot engines were constantly rushing and hissing, backing and whistling viciously, and in the midst of which Will moved at the continual risk of his life, as cool as a cucumber, so Bob Garvey expressed it, and as safe as the bank. Although thus situated in the midst of smoke, noise, dust, iron and steam, Will Garvey managed to indulge his love for flowers. He had a garden on the line, between the very rails. It was not large, to be sure, only about 6 feet by 2, but it was large enough for his limited desires. The garden was in a wooden trough in front of his sentry-box. It contained mignonette, roses, and heartsease, among other things, and every time that Will passed out of or into his box in performing the duties connected with the station, he took a look at the flowers, and thought of Lou, and the innumerable boys, girls, and babies at home. We need not say that this garden was beautifully kept. Whatever Will did, he did well, probably because he tended well the garden of his own soul. While he was standing outside his box during one of the brief intervals between trains, an extremely beautiful girl came on the platform and called across the rails to him. "Hello, Gertie! What brings you here?" he asked, with a look of glad surprise. "To see you," replied Gertie, with a smile that was nothing short of bewitching. "How I wish you were a flower, that I might plant you in my garden," said the gallant William, as he crossed the rails and reached up to shake Gertie's hand. "What a greedy man you are," said Gertie. "Isn't Lou enough for you?" "Quite enough," replied Will. "I might almost say more than enough at times. But come, lass, this ain't the place for a palaver. You came to speak with me as well as to see me, no doubt." "Yes, Will, I came with a message from Mrs Tipps. You know that the railway men are going to present father with a testimonial to-night. Well, Mrs Tipps thinks that her drawing-room won't be large enough, so she sent me to ask you to let the men know that it is to be presented in the schoolroom, where the volunteer rifle band is to perform and make a sort of concert of it." "Indeed!" said Will. "Yes, and Mrs Tipps says that Captain Lee is going to give them what she calls a cold collation, and Brother Bob calls a blow-out." "You don't say so!" exclaimed Will. "Yes, I do. Won't it be delightful?" said Gertie. "Splendid!" replied Will. "I'll be sure to be up in good time. But I say, Gertie, is young Dorkin to be there?" Gertie blushed, but was spared the necessity of a reply in consequence of a deafening whistle which called Will Garvey to his points. Next moment a passenger train intervened, and cut her off from further communication. According to promise, Will was at the schoolroom in good time that evening, for some 30 or 40 of his comrades. Lou was there too, blooming and matronly, with a troop of boys and girls who seemed to constitute themselves a bodyguard round John Marrot and his wife, who were both ignorant at that time of the honour that was about to be done them. John was as grave, sturdy, and amiable as ever, the only alteration in his appearance being the increased number of silver locks that mingled with his black hair. Time had done little to Mrs Marrot, beyond increasing her bulk and the rosiness of her countenance. It would be tedious to comment on all our old friends who assembled in the schoolroom on that memorable occasion. We can only mention the names of Captain Lee, alias Samuel Tough, and Mr Abel, and Mrs Tipps, and Dr Noble, and Mr Sharp, and David Blunt, and Joe Turner, and Mrs Derby, with all of whom time seemed to have dealt as leniently as with John Marrot and his wife. Sam Natalie was also there, with his invalid wife restored to robust health, and supported on either side by a blooming boy and girl. And Edwin Gurwood was there with his wife and son, and 3 daughters, and so was Joseph Tipps, looking as if the world prospered with him, as indeed was the case. And, of course, Netta Tipps was there, and the young curate, who, by the way, was much stouter, and not nearly so stiff as when we first met him. He was particularly attentive to Netta, and called her "my dear," in a cool, free, and easy way that would not have been tolerated for a moment, but for the fact that they had been married for the last 3 months. Bob Marrot was there also, as strapping a young blade as one could wish to see, with a modest yet fearless look in his eye that was quite in keeping with his occupation as driver of the Flying Dutchman. There was there also a tall, slim, good-looking youth, who seemed to be on very intimate terms with Bob Marrot. He was well known as one of the most rising men at the Clatterby Works, who bade fair to become an overseer ere long. Bob called him Tom Tit, but the men of the line styled him Mr Dorkin. He had brought with him an extremely wrinkled, dried-up old woman, who appeared to have suffered much, and to have been dragged out of the lowest depths of poverty. To judge from appearances, she had been placed in a position of great comfort. Such was in truth the case, and the fine young fellow who had dragged her out and up was that same Mr Dorkin, who may be said to have been all but stone blind that evening, because from first to last he saw but one individual there, and that individual was Gertie. He was almost deaf too, because he only heard one voice, and that voice was Gertie's. And Nanny Stocks was there, with the baby, but not the baby Marrot. That baby, now a stout, well-grown lad, was seated beside his mother, paying her all sorts of delicate attentions, such as picking up her handkerchief when she dropped it, pushing her bonnet on her head when, in her agitation, it fell back on her neck, and beating her firmly on the back when she choked, as she frequently did that evening from sheer delight. No doubt in the last operation he felt that he was paying off old scores, for many a severe beating on the back had Mrs Marrot given him in the stormy days of his babyhood. The baby of whom Nanny Stocks was now the guardian was baby Gurwood, and a strong resemblance it bore to the old baby in the matters of health, strength, fatness, and self-will. Miss Stocks was one of those human evergreens which years appeared to make no impression on at all. From her shoe-latchet to her topmost hairpin, she was unalterably the same as she had been in days gone by. She treated the new baby, too, as she had treated the old, choked it with sweetmeats and kisses, and acted the part of buffer to its feet and fists. It would take a volume to give the full details of all that was said and done, and played and sung on that Christmas Eve. We can only touch on these things. The brass band of the Volunteers surpassed itself. The songs, volunteered or called for, were as good as songs usually are on festive occasions, a few of them being first-rate, especially one which was sung by a huge engine-driver, with shoulders about a yard broad, and a beard like the inverted shako of a guardsman. It ran thus: Song of the Engine-driver. Oh, down by the river and close by the lake, we skim like the swallow and cut through the brake, over the mountain and round by the lea, through the black tunnel and down to the sea. Clatter and bang by the wild riven shore, we mingle our shriek with the ocean's roar. We strain and we struggle, we rush and we fly, we're a terrible pair, my steed and I. Whistle and puff the whole day round, over the hills and underground, rattling fast and rattling free. Oh, a life on the line is the life for me. With our hearts a-blazing in every chink, with coals for food and water to drink, we plunge up the mountain and traverse them all, and startle the grouse in our daily tour. We yell at the deer in their lonely glen, shoot past the village and circle the ben. We flash through the city on viaducts high, as straight as an arrow, my steed and I. Whistle and puff the whole day round, over the hills and underground, rattling fast and rattling free. Oh, a life on the line is the life for me. The Norseman of old, when quaffing his mead, delighted to boast of his ocean steed. The British tar in his foaming beer drinks to his ship as his mistress dear. The war horse good is the trooper's theme, but what are all these to the horse of steam? Such a riotous, rollicking roadster is he. Oh, the iron horse is the steed for me. Whistle and puff the whole day round, over the hills and underground, rattling fast and rattling free. Oh, a life on the line is the life for me. The collation also, or, according to Bob Marrett, the blowout, was superb. Joseph Tipps declared it to be eminently satisfactory, and the men of the line evidently held the same opinion, if we may judge from the fact that they consumed it all and left not a scrap behind. The speeches also were excellent. Of course the great one of the evening was the best, being delivered by Mr. Abel, who not unnaturally made a remarkable able oration. When that gentleman rose with a beautiful silver model of a locomotive in his hand, which he had been deputed by the men of the line to present as a mark of their regard, admiration, and esteem to John Marrett, he took the worthy ex-engine driver very much by surprise, and caused Mrs. Marrett to be seized with such a fit of choking that the baby, not the new one but the old, found it as hard work to beat her out of it as she had formerly found it to beat him out of a fit of wickedness. When she had been restored, Mr. Abel launched off into a glowing oration, in the course of which he referred to John Marrett's long services, to his faithful and unwearied attention to his arduous duties, and to the numerous instances wherein he had shown personal courage and daring, amounting almost to heroism, in saving the lives of comrades in danger, and in preventing accidents on the line by coolness and presence of mind. In conclusion, said Mr. Abel, winding up, let me remark that the gift which is now presented might have been of a more useful character, but could not have been more appropriate, because the wish of those who desire to testify their regard to you this evening, Mr. Marrett, is not to give you an intrinsically valuable or useful present, but to present you with a characteristic ornament which may grace your dwelling while you live, and descend, after you are gone, to your children's children. Here he glanced at Lou and her troop, to bear witness to them that you nobly did your duty in driving that great iron horse, whereof this little silver pony is a model and a memorial. To perform one's duty well in this life is the highest ambition that any man can have in regard to temporal things. Nelson, our greatest naval hero, aimed at it, and on the glorious day of Trafalgar signalled that England expected every man to do it. Wellington, our greatest soldier, made duty his guiding star. The effectual and earnest performance of duty stamps with a nobility which is not confined to great men, a nobility which kings can neither give nor take away, a nobility which is very, very difficult to attain unto, but which is open alike to the prince and the peasant, and must be wrought hard for and won, or lost with shame. For, as the poet happily puts it, honour and shame from no condition rise. Act well your part, there all the honour lies. For myself I can only say that John Marrett has won this nobility, and I couple his name with a sentiment with which all here, I doubt not, will heartily sympathise. Prosperity to the men of the line, and success to the Iron Horse. Reader, we can do no better than echo that sentiment, and wish you a kind farewell. End of chapter 25, the last. Recording by J. Wills. End of The Iron Horse by Robert Michael Ballantine.